Welcome to the Coffee House, which is a private club 105 years old in New York City. Donna was a member before she moved away. She's a speaker and a consultant focused on women's voice and speech. She's also the founder of Speaking While Female, the first ever online collection of contemporary and historical speeches by women from across time and around the world. Donna helps organizations develop their talented women with thought leadership campaigns, coaching, speaking, and workshops. Her clients come from the world of business, the public sector, and the arts. She earned degrees with honors from Yale and the University of Texas. For more on how she helps organizations attract, retain, and develop their women leaders, you can see speakingwhilefemale.biz.
.biz.
Okay, and so let me welcome Donna to our Zoom thing. Well, this is quite a fun thing. We welcome you to our Zoom organization, and thank you very much for coming.
Your Zoom thing. Thank you, Frances. Thank you for that welcome. Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Coffee House. As Frances mentioned, I was a member for a number of years, and then I've been sort of an honorary member and have come to some events in the years since and love the Coffee House, especially since it is the most historically minded and erudite club in New York. And that's the perfect audience for all of us who love history and want to talk about history and the lessons that we learned for the present from the past. As Frances mentioned, I'm an advocate for women's voice and speech, but this is really my third act. My first act was as a journalist. I worked for a number of newspapers and magazines and even did some TV work. I worked in the States and I lived in London for quite a few years and worked there for some publications. But now I'm back in the States and on to my third act. My second act, I skipped the second act, was as a speechwriter. When I came back from London, I worked as a speechwriter for a number of leaders in the private sector and the public sector, philanthropy. But then I started to notice that there was an absence, I would say, of a lack of women's voices in the public sphere, in the marketplace of ideas. And I took a turn, I shifted my business, and now I focus on women. And today I'm going to give you a short overview of how I went down a rabbit hole, I suppose, maybe into a black hole, except it's the opposite of a black hole because it's enlightening. It's like a white hole. I've learned an enormous amount about the history of speech mostly in our country and in Great Britain, but around the world, but also the history of women's speech in particular. I did most of my research using books like this, which is a book of an anthology of speeches. This is my show and tell part of my talk. Another one, I have another one here. But as you'll hear, great speeches and speakers in history, as you'll hear as I share more information, that this is just a small number of the overall collection of anthologies that I've looked at as I've dug deeper into the history of rhetoric and eloquence in history. I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint presentation, and then at the end, I'll come back on. Let me make sure I shared it right. Share screen. Okay. Can you see my presentation? I'm looking for a thumbs up. Okay. I call this talk and I call this research, this endeavor, the secret history of women's speech, because it really is a secret. Not enough people, in fact, hardly any people, know that women have a history of rhetoric and oratory. So when we think of women, of powerful speakers, we think of the greatest speakers in history, the speakers who've really changed the world. It's overwhelmingly male, right? And this is just a sample of The people who are generally associated with great eloquence and rhetoric, Lincoln, Churchill, JFK, MLK, and Reagan, but they are all members of the male species. The greatest rhetorician of all times is considered to be Cicero. He was a statesman, Roman statesman, a great speaker, of course, in the Roman Forum. And he also is the father of rhetoric. And he's acclaimed, of course, throughout time for his ability to create an argumentation for persuasion. In fact, Boris Johnson is always nattering on about Cicero, and he's really Boris Johnson's touchstone. Boris Johnson, of course, being a classicist who spoke in the Oxford Union. So we have this tremendous tradition of male oratory and associated with virtue, right? And the Latin association, the Roman association of virtue meaning something manly, right? Being manly and being powerful was associated with being male. So what I've done is I went through speech collections like the ones that I showed you, looking for examples of women's speech. And what I found was actually, what I didn't find was many examples of women's speech. And I pulled them all together into this infographic that I've called How the History of Speech Forgot About Women's Speech. So you can imagine the forgot, that I'm making air quotes around the word forgot, because I'm being a bit facetious. What you see in front of you is really too hard for you to read at this distance, but it is an infographic, and every single one of those spots on there is a different speech anthology that I looked at. There's about 180, I think 185 of them there, 180 speech collections. And I just added them all up, added up the number of speeches and added up the number of men, added up the number of women. And you can see that all the dark blue at the top, all the way down to 2/3 of the infographic, that's men. And this light green is women. That's a representation of the number of men's speeches and the number of women's speeches. Here, I zoomed in on just the top so you can see. Women have been speaking up through the ages, but you wouldn't know it from reading speech collections. Here's how they stack up. So then the next step, of course, when I realized that women were so terribly underrepresented, was to start collecting women's speeches. And I put them all into a speech site that I'll talk about. But here's an example of one of those books, just so you can get a flavor, a treasury of great American speeches, our country's life and history, in the words of its great men. It's great men. I think the gentleman on the right is supposed to be Abe Lincoln, but it's just an example of the kind of ways that rhetoric has been formulated. The greatest were, and of course we know that men have primarily been the statesmen, they've been the legislators throughout history, they've held positions of institutional power, but women have also been powerful with their voices. Here's another example of a charming little book, The White House Handbook of Oratory. It was published in, I think, 1898, 1899, something like that. And it is a collection of speeches, but it's also more than that. It also has tips and instruction on powerful rhetoric and examples of how men should comport themselves and hold themselves when they are speaking. Here's an example of defiance. Here's one called Ridicule, Malediction. These are admittedly a bit ridiculous, but they do demonstrate that men have been educated in how to hold themselves, how to speak in public powerfully, and we associate the very act of speaking powerfully as a male endeavor. So we've seen the messages that men get. What messages do women get? A woman being punished for being a common scold. She's being dipped in the river, dunked in the river. I don't know if she'll ever come back. A scold is one of those terms we associate with women, right? How come men never get called scolds? This woman's problem was likely that she talked too much for the men around her. It's comfort. Here's another one, I wonder if any of you have ever heard of the Branks. The Branks was a method of torture that was instituted in Scotland, in the border region between Scotland and northern England in the 17th century. Branking is another term for it, and it also has a few names. Also, Scold's Guard, Witch's Guard. It was like a chastity belt, a metal belt or a metal instrument that went around the speaker's head. Here you can see the speaker has this instrument around her head, and usually there was a metal bit, like a horse's bridle, that would depress into her tongue if she spoke too much or spoke at all in this case. And you can see in the back that she's chained to that post. So a woman who was deemed to be too mouthy, right? Mouthy woman, she spoke too much, she was a scold. She would be forced to wear this instrument, and it was a way of not just keeping her quiet, but public humiliation. It was a public act. This is another Scold's Guard. These are really gruesome, a muzzle. And these illustrations are based on actual instruments that are in a museum, I think in Carlisle, anyway, in the north of England. These actually still exist today. These are all different versions of the Scold's Guard. You can find this on Google. Just Google Scold's Guard and you'll get all this information. You can see in the one on the left, the bit that would depress into the woman's tongue. Okay, now these are all postcards. Some of them come from my own collection because I am a deltiologist, that's a postcard collector. But they also come from the Glasgow Women's Library in Glasgow, Scotland. And you can see that they've taken this instrument. It's a what do you call it? Clamp, it's a clamp, and just put it around this poor woman's head. If you've got a wife that nags, just get one of these patent gags. Now, this was a genre of postcards that emerged right around the end of World War I, which also coincided with not coincidentally, it coincided with the final push for suffrage. And of course, women were perceived to be a tremendous threat, and the more they spoke, the more threatening they were. And so these postcards emerged that borrowed from this public torture instrumentation and applied it to women. And I'm only going to show you a handful of them. I think I have 6 here. But as the kids say, this is a trigger warning because these are gruesome. I wish I could tell you, but my mouth is clamped shut. Notice how the tongue figures very prominently in these issues. And of course, you see the peace at last. That was the motto that was attached to the armistice agreement that was signed between the Allies and the enemies. Who were the enemies in World War I? I can't remember the name for the maybe someone can remind me later. But anyway, peace at last, peace at last, peace at last.
It's the Axis.
Oh, the Axis, thank you. I knew it started with an A. Peace at last, if women would only shut up. There's no end to a woman's tongue. Hush, not a word. These are awful. I laugh because there's no other response because they're just too awful. Ah, there's one. The woman has a serpent instead of a tongue. And lastly, I'd rather kiss her than hear her talk. Votes for women. She's on the soapbox. Well, it is kind of cute, but it is infantilizing. I'd rather kiss her than hear her talk. So what I did with all this information is, oh, last one, sorry, I forgot about this one, the Calvin Company, the trouble with women. The Calvin Company was a company that made industrials, advertising industrials or films. It was in Kansas City. It's defunct now. But actually, interestingly, as a side note, see, I'm having a senior moment. What's his name? The film director who made Nashville, Robert Altman used to work there. He got his start at the Calvin Company. But the point of this is the trouble with women, they have mouths. They're troublesome because they speak. So what did I do with all this information and this new knowledge? I created a website. I actually created it overnight in December of 2018 because I got fed up of looking at all these heavily male dominated and represented speech anthologies. And I called it Speaking While Female Speech Bank. And it's grown and it's grown and it's grown. And what it is a collection of women's oratory, women's rhetoric from all over the world, from across time. And I just loaded them all onto the website, and it's grown and grown and grown. I think I now have 1,500 or 1,600 speeches by women on the site. And they're divided into, I think, 13 categories now. And I'm about to change it around and make some more categories because I keep finding more and more speeches. Most of the speeches are historical in nature. So that means before 1924, making them in the United States still in the public domain. Some of them are more contemporary, but I don't feel that my role here is to replicate a TEDx or YouTube. I don't really feel like I need to replicate or present contemporary speeches by women. I just have them in the mix, but mostly I want people to know that women have been speaking. Women have not been silent. And that we need to know this as part of our history, because we all need to have a different conception of rhetoric, of history, of powerful speaking, and also role models for all of us, for our children, for our grandchildren, for generations to come. I want any girl, any woman to be able to look at this site and experience it and dig into it and see what a powerful woman sounds like, because I have audio on the site as well when possible, what she looks like and what her words are. So that's the goal of the site. Now I'm going to share with you 3 women speakers who are not in any of the history books and tell you a little bit about them and their history and their backgrounds as my candidates for entry into the women's anthologies. And of course, no surprise, I'm planning to create my own women's anthology. And you can be sure that this woman's speech will be there. This is Helen Hamilton Gardener. She was an author and a writer and a free thinker who espoused such radical ideas as the belief that women should get higher education. I know it's radical, and that also that there should be an age of consent for sexual relations. So young girls shouldn't be allowed to have, men shouldn't be allowed to have sex with young girls without suffering penalties. So she also was a dogged suffragist, and she started digging into this conception. I know it's shocking, but there was a belief that women supposedly had smaller skulls than men and therefore were less intelligent than men and therefore shouldn't be allowed to vote. Well, she just didn't believe it. And so she lived in Manhattan, and she started doing research. Actually, she reached out to neurologists around the world, but she really hooked up with this gentleman who was the world's leading neurologist. Spitzka was his name, Edward Charles Spitzka. And she had an office on Fifth Avenue, and she spent a year looking through the microscope, learning about mouse brains and neurological tissues. She marshaled all the facts and all the data, and then she pulled it all together, and she delivered it in a speech that she gave at a women's conference in 1888. It was the International Council of Women, refuting the idea that women were biologically destined to be less intelligent than men. I'm going to show you a few more pictures of her. This is Helen Hamilton Gardener at an older age. And here she is with a couple other famous suffragists. She's on the right, lower right-hand corner, in the hat that looks like Napoleon's hat. Standing on her right, our left, is Carrie Chapman Catt, and then on her left is the great Anna Howard Shaw, all famous suffragists. So she gives a talk in 1888 called Sex in Brain. It causes a sensation. It gets translated into a bunch of different languages, published all over the world, and it presents the latest in neurological thinking, which is that there is no biological basis for women being less intelligent than men. And when Helen Hamilton Gardener died, what does she do? That is actually her brain. She donates her brain to science. Her brain is in a jar on the shelf in a collection in Providence, Rhode Island, the Brain Tissue Resource Center. It was weighed and it was measured. And here are other pictures of Helen Hamilton Gardener's brain. published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. That's the top view. So she is one of my top candidates. Actually, Sex in Brain is one of my top candidates for inclusion in my new anthology of women's speech. Next, Clara Foltz. She was the first lawyer in California. She studied for the bar, but she actually never got a law degree because she was not allowed to study at the University of California Law School. And she actually sued the state of California to be admitted to law school. But by the time they let her in, she had so much debt and she was raising a family on her own because her husband had walked out on her and the kids. So she didn't have enough money to actually go to law school, but she managed to pass the bar. She was practicing and she was a trial attorney. That means she saw with her own eyes what was going on in the court of law. There she is, dressed up in her finest. Now, Clara Shortridge Foltz, believed, based on her experience, that it is no crime to be poor. And she saw over and over that poor people who went into court didn't receive equal consideration from the law like the wealthy did. So she was the first person to propose in a speech on August 8th, 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago, a speech called The Rights of Persons Accused of a Crime. She was the first person to propose a public defender system, a state-sponsored, government-sponsored public defender system, which meant that the indigent, the poor who were accused of a crime, would get equal representation under the law. This is the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., equal justice under law. So after her proposal, the speech was actually lost until it was published in a couple law journals in the 1890s, contemporaneous with her speech, and then, or right after her speech, and then it was virtually lost, and I was able to dig it out, and it's published on my site. Needless to say, all the speeches I talk about are on my site, but this one was never seen for over 100 years until I published it. And at the end of the speech, she makes a move that public speakers call a call to arms, like CTA we call it. Call to arms means she invades upon her audience, or she prompts the audience, or challenges the audience, challenges the country to let the courts of law be fair. So she falls into the greatest traditions of rhetoric by summoning her audience to a greater cause. And after she proposed this, there were public defender systems initiated, of course, all across the country, some more successfully than others. And now I think it's generally considered to be a real mess. They never get enough money. They don't do that great of a job, but it exists. And so we hope that with different political leaders, that they will find a way to invest more money in the system so that it will work the way Clara Shortridge Foltz conceived of it. Sarah Winnemucca, she's my third candidate for inclusion in our pantheon of women speakers. She was a member of she was a Native American and a member of the Northern Paiute tribe. And here you can see where they were. They were a little bit in California, Nevada, and a little bit in Idaho and Oregon. This is a picture of the Paiutes in Nevada. I don't think she's in that picture, but you can see what they lived like. They were nomads, right? They traveled around eating seeds and hunting game, and they lived on their land, which of course they didn't realize that they needed to own the land until white settlers came along and pioneers and bought the land and took the land away from them. This is Sarah Winnemucca's father, Chief Winnemucca, and he would go with her and her brother on the road, and because she knew English, she would be a translator for the government agents. And they also performed on the stage in San Francisco in a kind of variety show. There she is. She would dress up like an Indian princess. I don't know that she was exactly a princess, but there she is with her little wampum bag. And so she had some experience on the stage, and that's where she caught the attention of the Peabody sisters. The two Peabody sisters, one of them was married to Horace Mann, the educator. They were very wealthy sisters who lived in Boston, and they paid for her to make a trip to the East Coast. First she wrote a book about her people and how her people had been trampled on and their rights taken away and their cultures denigrated by the white man. And the Peabody sisters paid for her to make a trip to the East Coast in the 1890s, where she spoke in Providence, she spoke in Boston, but she also landed in Washington, D.C., where she gave testimony to Congress in 1884 to a subcommittee on Indian Affairs, in which she described how her people were forcibly removed. That's a forced march 300 miles north from their homelands, their native homelands, into what was known as Washington Territory. And they went over 3 mountain ranges on foot in the dead of winter. It was so cold that the mothers were holding their babies in their arms, and some babies froze to death. They died of cold, and they couldn't even bury them alongside the road because the road was frozen solid. So she described to these congressmen how they had to leave the babies by the side of the road without proper burial. It was heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. And like I said, you can read it on my site. Sadly, it had little effect on the congressman, but it was in the public record. And to my great irritation, stronger than that, I was really angry when I realized that you couldn't find this testimony anywhere. So I wrote to the Winnemucca Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, and requested this testimony. And this was about a year ago. Within about an hour, I got the testimony sent back to me. So like I said, it's now on the site for all to read and appreciate. And of course, this testimony should be taught in every history book and every social studies book and every rhetoric book and every debate book across the country, because it's just that powerful. So here you see all 3 women that I've talked about, and I'll pose this question in sort of as a rhetorical question: what do all these women have in common? Helen Hamilton Gardener, Clara Foltz, and Sarah Winnemucca. The way I see it, there's 3 things they have in common. First of all, they all faced hurdles for using their voices. It was really not acceptable for women to step up and speak, or it wasn't common, and they all faced prejudice, criticism, calumny. I mean, there's a long history of abusing women for using their voices. The great Sojourner Truth one time was speaking in public in the mid-19th century, 1850s or 60s, and someone accused her of being a male. "Are you a man?" they would call out, and she ripped open her blouse to prove that she wasn't a man. It's a famous story. Lucy Stone, another speaker from the mid-19th century, she also one time was giving a speech, and someone broke the window and threw cold water on top of her head. And according to her daughter, who wrote about this in a memoir, she just put on a shawl and went on speaking. But there's a long history of women facing obstacles and criticism for using their voices. The second thing they have in common is that they all understood that a speech is more than just a speech. It's more than just words. It's a kind of act, right? It's a declaration. It's a call to her audience, to audiences to step up and to do something of significance. So there were so many other women speakers that, of course, we haven't had a chance to talk about. This is the great Rankin, Jeanette Rankin. She was the first woman to serve in Congress. She actually came from the state of Montana, and they sent her to Congress before women even had the vote, making her the first woman in history to legally vote for women to get the vote, the first woman to legally vote for women to get the vote. And she actually introduced the legislation that became the 19th Amendment. This is Lucy Branham. She was just released from Occoquan workhouse in Virginia, and she's wearing her prison outfit, her prison uniform, when she's speaking right there. And this is the great Rosa Schneiderman, who was speaking on behalf of the Trade Union League in New York. Just a handful of examples. Oh, Rose, of course. Oh, how come I'm not thinking of her name? Rose, who sat in the front of the boat. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks. So thousands of women who've spoken throughout history, and I want their names to be known so that all of us, all of the women here, all of us who have daughters and granddaughters and mothers and grandmothers will encourage them to speak out. And of course, provide more respect to women's voices, because as you know, women, Even today, in our political sphere, in our public sphere, women are often criticized because their voices are perceived to be too high or too low or not powerful enough. And I want us to get past this legacy of criticism and bias and accept that women's voices are as powerful as men's. So that's the secret history of women's speech. And I invite you all to investigate my website. And when you find examples of women's speeches, powerful examples of speech that aren't there, please get in touch and let me know so I can add them to the archive.
Thank you so much, Donna Rubin. This was such a fascinating and inspiring talk. Thank you for joining us for our Coffee House Club virtual events series. And we hope that everyone will go and check out your site. I definitely will. It seems like such an incredibly invaluable and necessary resource. And thank you again.